Hello, everybody. Welcome to the lecture on early medieval Europe and the larger world. So to begin, it's important to discuss the burial mounds at Sutton Hoo, which gives us a really important source of information about art and culture uh, in Anglo-Saxon England, in addition to things like religion, history, architecture that we've been looking at before. We're also going to be looking a little bit deeper into some of the art, literature, and poetry of the time. And so in Sutton Hoo, it gives us an example of a kind of non-Christian Germanic culture. And we see the types of art here depicted, a type of animal style jewelry that is quite ornate and is interlaced with depictions of these animals in kind of a hexagon shape. And for the time, this type of jewelry is quite impressive. And again, will give us a sense of the culture, a type of romantic literary culture that can be depicted in these artifacts, these pieces of jewelry. And so when we think of the English language, we think of it being shaped by Anglo-Saxon traditions. A lot of names, dates, places, all come from this Anglo-Saxon history. The law in which we follow today comes from this particular time period, um, based on the idea of this kind of life price of an individual, the worth of an individual, and individual rights. One particular story that really gets into this kind of life worth of an individual um, is the story, the poem, the epic poem of Beowulf, the oldest recorded um, story found in England between 700 and 1000 CE, and it reflects the aspects of life in Northern Europe. It talks about the theme that every person is celebrated for life and death. It's very much a story of the temporary period in which we have on this earth. And at the end of the poem, Beowulf displays this Christ-like willingness to sacrifice himself for the greater good. And again, this kind of gives idea of society's understanding of worth, cultivation of society, very utilitarian in terms of promoting the greater good despite individual prospects, and is something that is constantly dealt with, that we are constantly at odds with here 1,000 to 1,500 years later. And so in about 635, we start to see a kind of a re-Christianization of Britain, a move back to a kind of Christian style, merging of the kind of pagan and Christian religious styles. And the basic elements of these are depicted in art, in a kind of animal style um, art that we can see here is a piece of a manuscript page from a gospel. And so these kind of mixing styles is or gives us a kind of greater sense of the expanding world, of the expanding influence of Christianity in this time, which is particularly important. And in 768 to 814, Charlemagne gained control of most of the European continent and forced what was under his control to really give up their brand of Christianity and really focus on that kind of Nicene Creed from Rome, really create a unification of this Catholic Church and this Christianization. And it was with Pope Leo III who crowned Charlemagne emperor on Christmas Day in 800 CE. And it was here that we refer, or what would later be known as, the Holy Roman Empire. So here we have in 814 a depiction of the Empire of Charlemagne. Again, we see here most of Europe being represented. And as we've seen earlier in this class, the more territory that gets enveloped in these different empires, the more you see culture and tradition spread and combine to really kind of create what it is that we celebrate today and the type of people that we are today. We see these different aspects of these different cultures, these different empires that kind of bleed through the times and really make us who we are and create the civilization that we're familiar with. And it was with the Song of Roland and kind of chivalric values that really puts a mark on this particular time frame. And it's with Charlemagne's military achievements that are being praised in these songs of heroes and the deeds that these heroes stand for and have done. And it's with these that we get this kind of syllabic, kind of one note per syllable style of poetry that is going to usher in a new literary time, a new literary theme to which we're still very familiar today. So with the Song of Roland, it's really one of the earliest expressions of this chivalric code, right? When we think of chivalry, we think back to the knights of the Round Table. We think back to the honor and code of warriors and civilizations and kings and queens, really to maintain this kind of a social order, to maintain a political harmony that exists throughout medieval Europe. And it's with Charlemagne really promoting this literary or literacy throughout the empire, kind of creating a curriculum that promoted reading and writing throughout the empire. And so the emphasis really within this particular empire was on the education of people, particularly those from a noble birth. But we need to take baby steps, right? And so the promotion of education aimed at really expanding the tradition of the church, expanding our theology of understanding why it is that the church functions in this particular way, reasons for why we should follow these particular decrees or promoting these particular morals, and so forth. And it's with these medieval monasteries that really Charlemagne imposed the rule of Benedict of Nursia to really kind of create what he believed was the ideal monastery. In this particular monastery, right, the exemplary monastery was the monastery at St. Gall. And for Charlemagne, it was the case that we would divide into 8 parts this kind of schedule of liturgical praise, the divine office, creating prayers, creating these hymns, to which if you've ever been to a Christian or Catholic church, it would be very familiar to hear these types of songs that, again, are still expressed in similar fashion today, right? Again, kind of creating that uniformity. So this ideal monastery at St. Gall really functions as a depiction of how all monasteries should be created. And again, we look at the architecture here, and not just architecture that's pretty, not just architecture that serves one particular purpose, but something that's symbolic and has meaning and serves many functions. And so we see here, adjacent to the church, is a cloister, a kind of rectangular courtyard, really typically arcaded and dedicated to contemplation, a type of meditation place. To the south of the cloister, the refectory, or kind of dining hall. And so we see that there are purposeful aspects to where everything is located, the use of these different rooms and spaces, the utilization of not just space but also empty space that we see goes into these architectural wonders. It goes into these buildings. They're not just building places, they're not just building monasteries by throwing up 4 walls and then just other walls in between and cordoning off specific spots for specific things. These are very well thought out, useful, and symbolic structures. And for these monasteries, these type of liturgical praises, the music that goes into these particular ceremonies becomes a kind of standardized harmonic expression. And so we see this again, even in modern day, this kind of monophonic songs, which are sung in many voices, but kind of with a single melodic line, where there's no real harmony, right? And it's what we would refer to now as this Gregorian chant. And again, all based on this kind of uniformity, everyone getting on the same page, everybody kind of understanding the expression of the church, understanding the theology, understanding the community and social organization that these monasteries, that the church is really trying to promote. And so, in its simplest form, this kind of Gregorian chant is sung as an a cappella. So there's no musical accompaniment, right? This is what we see with popular TV shows like Glee, right? Where we see the melodic uh, expression through just syllabic style, through song, through chanting of all individuals present. And so this became the norm. This became the expression and growth of the church, and became perhaps one of the most important single elements of determining the nature of a given chant or melody, of the given song expressed in these monasteries. It became one of the most important parts of the particular liturgy. And again, if anyone has been to a Catholic church, this can be heavily seen in a sense that with an hour-long sermon, you really only get maybe 20 minutes or so of communication back and forth. The rest of the time is spent in song, in chant, which again, to this day, expresses that influence from over 1,500 years ago. So moving forward with the Norman invasion of England, we also see a kind of focus and attention given to the design of castles for military defense. And these Motte and Bailey designs, constructions, that really give this kind of military edge or fortification that allows people to defend the castle. And so with these mottes, we have a kind of earthbound mound, kind of with an enclosed courtyard. So if you picture it's kind of a hill with a castle atop the hill with an empty courtyard, right? Very familiar with the depictions in present movies and television shows. This was the type of architecture that was really being utilized in England at the time. And speaking of military endeavors, we see with the Crusades in the late 1000 CE a type of influence and imperialism that really projects a culture, projects a societal way of thinking throughout Europe and the Middle East of this time. And so with the First Crusade, we see the desire to really reduce conflict at home by sending off Europe's feuding aristocrats. Right? We see a defense of Christendom from barbarity, to play on the kind of nobility's sense of adventure, to play on their temper and hot-bloodedness. The way we might see trying to tire out a child by giving them an extreme physical activity to do, or running around with a dog to tire him or her out, right? This was a kind of sense of that First Crusade, sold as the idea for defending Christianity, but really to reduce conflict at home in Europe. It's with the First, Second, and Third Crusade that we see religiously and politically that there's a failure. There's not that defense of Christendom, but more so really cemented other religions of the time, particularly that of Islam. And so really, rather than freeing the Holy Land from Muslim influence, it created a greater sense of Islamic dominance. One thing that the first three Crusades did do, however, was that they were very successful in opening up trade between West and East. And it wasn't until the Fourth Crusade in 1202 that there becomes this kind of profitability. And so Venice agreed to transport 30,000 crusaders in return for destroying commercial rivals in the Adriatic and Aegean seas. And so with all of these crusades, we see as kind of a background this religious importance, this religious desire, this religious aim. But for the most part, these crusades were about much more than that. More focused on calming nerves at home, on profitability, on trade. And so we typically see these crusades as a very negative endeavor taken up by the West, taken up by the church. Another thing that comes out of this time period, out of the Crusades, however, again, is this chivalric culture. And even though the Crusades can be expressed as anti-chivalric, we see a sense of this secular culture and literary movement that becomes celebrated through art and literature as what we typically refer to as courtly love. And so expressions of this come about through troubadour poetry, originating in southern France, right? But comprised of songs and poems, of which we focus our attention on the love and longing of the noblemen, of the knights, going back to that King Arthur's court, and really doing things out of sense of purpose and duty. And so these love songs are typically portrayed by a nobleman for a woman who is usually unattainable, either through marriage or higher status. Again, we see these types of stories originate, but continue to be expressed throughout tradition, throughout society, in eventually what will be Shakespearean culture and stories like Romeo and Juliet. But this idea of courtly love coming from this time period can really be expressed through the story of King Arthur and Lancelot and Lady Guinevere. These stories that focus attention on this unattainable love, this medieval romance. And so it's with these types of poems and stories and songs that we really see an emphasis on this love this duty, this respect. And we continue this tradition even today through movies, through literature, through modern literature. And this sense of a longing for this feeling, longing for this situation. I mean, so many movies and books nowadays depict this idea of courtly love, this idea of romance. It becomes so appealing to us that it is something that's held on to and praised and celebrated throughout the centuries. While all this is happening in Europe, developments in China create for it a very uneasy period, particularly that in 2020 with the Han Dynasty. And during this time, we see a kind of spread of Buddhism, a kind of ethical system based less on social and civic duty, right? Contrasting with what we had just talked about in Europe, but more on responsibility and individuality of personal action. And so we see a shift in China that is somewhat compatible with that of Taoism. Remember this idea that it's through personal growth that we can make these changes in ourselves and make these changes in society and culture and the world, and really emphasize a mysticism and harmony with nature. And it's with the Tang Dynasty that really ushered in and reestablished a new period of peace and prosperity in China. And lasted roughly 650 years through the Song Dynasty, in which again there's this focus of infrastructure, the building of the Grand Canal that really united northern and southern China. Structures being built, which are depicted here, with projecting roofs and levels to which you can clearly see the impressive nature of these particular structures. So with the Song Dynasty, we see this emphasis on China that we haven't seen before. And we see it opening up as a world culture. And it's with Marco Polo and his travels throughout China that really describes cities as the most splendid city in the world, describes Hangzhou as the most splendid city in the world. And it's this opening up of trade, of influence, of culture, where you see the Song Dynasty really enjoying prosperity. And it's through here that we see an expanse of literature and books of songs where this idea and sense of Buddhism, of Taoism, really take hold, not just of Asia, but of also Europe as well. And so eventually, though, the Song Dynasty would succumb to Mongolia and the Mongol leader of Kublai Khan. And so the Mongols really controlled the highest posts in government in China at this time. And for the Chinese who were there, would think of Mongols as really just occupying their homeland. Not a revitalization or a reestablishment of China, not of changing of China, but of foreigners occupying a territory. And so it was in 1368 that the Mongols were eventually overthrown, and Zhunyunzang declared himself the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty. While this was going on in China, in Southeast Asian civilizations, and in India, the Indians were asserting their broad influence over Southeast Asia. And so Muslim invaders would enter northern India in the 11th and 12th centuries, and then Hinduism became increasingly popular and gradually asserted itself as the dominant Indian religion. But again, we see this influence. We see this trade and sharing of cultures. Maybe sharing is not necessarily the word, but mixing and blending of cultures due to military influence, due to trade on the Silk Road, due to traveling more easily through these areas. In Japan, however, Buddhism and the spread of these kind of Chinese ideals were not necessarily welcomed by all, and in fact were opposed. But Japan itself ushered in a kind of a courtly refinement of its own. This sense of love and romance that would be expressed in arts, expressed in literature, to which men lived these public lives, women lived private lives, but expressed this kind of behavior to which these civilizations would develop and be encouraged to behave in these public or private senses. And this was expressed through poetry as well. It was expressed through haiku and these writing systems. And again, focusing the attention on actually capturing history, capturing art through words. And so with the Kamakura period in 1185 to 1392 CE, that again, you see this romanticized depiction of the samurai and this warrior class that really were the ones to exercise military control. So when we think of Knights of the Round Table in England, we could also similarly attribute many of those same ideals to the samurai of Japan. This sense of duty, honor, respect. And while we see a development in art and literature throughout Europe and Asia, we also see a very similar expression and flourishing of the Americas. Pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, cultures comprised typically of present-day Nicaragua, Honduras, southern Mexico, ushered in this classic era to which the societies in the America would flourish as well as those in the Eastern Hemisphere. And it's within this Mesoamerican culture that we see Teotihuacán as a kind of comparable holy site to that of Constantinople in Europe and the Middle East, in the Old World. And this became the holy site for the Mayans, the Aztecs, and other Mesoamerican civilizations. And Mayan culture is that similar to ancient China, in that you have not necessarily a unified civilization, but instead these smaller kingdoms that all engage in warfare with one another. And it's in 900 CE that the Mayan culture collapses due to an overpopulation and due to economical and ecological degradation, war, political competition. And in addition to Mayan and Aztec and Mesoamerican culture, we see in South America complex cultures developing as well. And before 1300, we see it really corresponding with that of Europe in the Middle Ages, particularly in present-day Peru, where we see the creation of pyramids and artifacts that are similar to those that we might find in Europe.